My sister-in-law spent 11 years treating my kitchen like her personal restaurant. And I spent 11 years pretending I didn't notice. 3 days after my husband asked me to sign annulment papers, I drove to his mother's house and canceled the standing order that had been quietly paying for his nephew's private school tuition since the boy was in 3rd grade. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary evening that I now realize was the last one I'd ever spend, believing my marriage was solid ground. I was making my husband's favorite dinner, short ribs braised the way his late grandmother used to make them, with mashed potatoes and a green bean almondine I'd learned from a cooking class he'd gifted me for our 3rd anniversary. I'd been on my feet for almost 2 hours, and twice I'd had to grip the counter because a wave of nausea rolled through me so hard my vision blurred at the edges. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even him. I wanted tonight to be the night. I was 8 weeks pregnant. We'd been trying for 6 years. The smell of garlic should have made my mouth water. Instead, it made my stomach lurch, and I had to breathe through my nose and count to 10. The way the fertility counselor taught me back when this was still a fantasy instead of a fact. I'd cried in the parking lot of my OB's office after the ultrasound. Happy tears. The kind that come from somewhere so deep you don't recognize your own voice. The heartbeat had been steady and fast. A tiny flutter on the screen that the technician said was textbook perfect. I drove home with the printout pressed against the steering wheel, like it might fly away if I let go. I wanted to tell my husband over this dinner. I'd planned it for a week. The candles, the playlist we'd danced to at our wedding, the little gift bag with a pair of newborn socks tucked inside that I was going to set beside his plate. Then the front door opened without a knock, the way it always did, and my sister-in-law Renata walked in like she owned the deed. "God, it smells like a steakhouse in here," she said, dropping her designer tote on my freshly wiped counter and kicking off her heels in the middle of the kitchen floor. Her son Caleb trailed behind her, 12 years old, already glued to a tablet, already used to the fact that this house functioned as a second home whenever his mother decided she didn't feel like cooking. "Hi, Renata," I said, and went back to stirring the gravy, because 11 years had taught me that engaging only made things longer. She didn't even look at me. She walked straight to the dining room, sat down at the head of the table, my husband's seat, and started scrolling through her phone with the volume up loud enough that tinny pop music filled the hole downstairs. My mother-in-law, Carolyn, arrived 20 minutes later, the way she usually did when Renata texted her that dinner was happening at Daniel's house. She ran one finger along the edge of the table, the same finger she always used, checking for dust like she was a hotel inspector, and I was a maid who'd been warned twice already. "You missed a spot here," Carolyn said, tapping the table leg. Renata mentioned the corner by the window hasn't been done in a while either. I hadn't asked Masanata inspect my corners. I never had. I checked the clock. It was 5:45. Daniel, my husband, usually walked through the door by 6, tie loosened, looking exhausted from 12-hour shifts at the hospital where he worked as an anesthesiologist. I'd married a kind man, or at least a man who used to be kind before his mother and sister discovered exactly how far they could push him without him ever pushing back. By the time he got home, Renata had already helped herself to 2 glasses of the wine I'd been saving for our anniversary next month, and Caleb was sitting at the table demanding I make the sweet and sour chicken, not the gross beef thing. I made him a separate plate without a word. I always did. It was easier than the alternative, which was Carolyn reminding me. In that soft voice she used like a knife wrapped in a napkin, that family takes care of family, that Daniel worked himself to the bone for this household. And didn't I think the least I could do was keep everyone fed and happy? Dinner that night was loud in the way it always was when Renata came over. Her laughter too sharp, her stories too long. Caleb's tablet propped against the napkin holder playing cartoons at full volume because nobody told him to turn it down. I sat there with my hand resting under the table on my still flat stomach, waiting for a moment, any moment, where it would just be the two of us. It never came. By 9, Renata was still there, complaining that her landlord raised her rent again and wondering aloud, looking directly at Daniel, whether it wouldn't make more sense for everyone if she and Caleb just moved into the guest room for a few months. I watched my husband's face. I watched him not say no. That night, after they finally left, I lay in bed with the ultrasound photo in the drawer of my nightstand, and I told myself there would be another night. A quieter one. I didn't know yet that there wouldn't be. The bill came 2 days later. A tuition invoice from Caleb's private school, $15,000 a year addressed to our house, because Daniel had quietly added himself as a financial guarantor 4 years earlier. Something he'd done without really discussing it with me. The way he did most things involving his sister. I'd been the one transferring the payment every semester for 3 years, ever since Renata's temporary rough patch had stretched into something permanent. I set the envelope on the counter and didn't think much of it. It was just one more bill in a house full of other people's bills. What I didn't know was that Renata had spent the last several months telling Daniel a very different story about our marriage than the one I was living. I found out on a Thursday evening when Daniel came home early, sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table Carolyn liked to inspect for dust, and told me, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like his own, that he thought we should get the marriage annulled. Annulled, I repeated. Not divorced. Annulled. As though 7 years of my life, 7 years of birthdays and late nights and infertility appointments and his mother's casseroles I'd choke down with a smile, could simply be erased like they'd never happened. Renata thinks. He started. Renata, I said. She's been saying for a while that you've changed. That you're cold. Distant. That maybe we rushed into this. He wouldn't look at me when he said it. His hands were folded on the table like he was bracing for something. She thinks I deserve someone who actually wants to be part of this family. I sat very still. I thought about the gift bag with the newborn socks, still hidden in the hallway closet behind the winter coats. I thought about the heartbeat on the screen, fast and steady and textbook perfect. I thought about every dinner I'd cooked with my hand pressed secretly against my stomach, waiting for the right moment that his family never once gave me. And I thought, if this is what 7 years of trying to be enough gets me, I am done trying. Okay, I said. He blinked. I don't think he expected that. I think some small, cowardly part of him wanted me to fight, to cry, to beg him to reconsider, so he could feel like the wronged party, instead of the man who let his little sister talk him into ending his marriage over a clean countertop and an unwashed wine glass. I gave him none of that. I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, took down the divorce attorney's business card my own mother had pressed into my hand 2 years earlier. Just in case, sweetheart, every woman should have one, and called the number before he'd even finished his sentence in the kitchen. I didn't tell him about the pregnancy that night. I didn't tell him for a long time after that. What I did do, 3 days later, was call the private school's billing office and remove myself as the responsible party on Caleb's tuition account. I called our cable provider and took my name off the autopay for Carolyn's monthly streaming bundle, the one I'd been quietly covering since her fixed income speech 2 Christmases ago. I canceled the standing transfer to Renata's car insurance, the one Daniel had set up the year her policy lapsed, and she'd cried at our kitchen table about how she couldn't afford to drive to work. Bill by bill, I unwound 7 years of being the family's unpaid accountant, and I felt nothing but a strange, clean kind of relief, like setting down a bag I hadn't realized had been cutting into my shoulder the whole time. The fallout was immediate. Carolyn called me 11 times in 2 days. Renata showed up at my office of all places demanding to know, what kind of person cuts off a child's education out of spite? I let her finish. Then I told her, very calmly, that I wasn't her child's parent, that I had never agreed to be his guarantor for life, and that perhaps the real question was what kind of person spends 3 years letting another woman pay for things she's fully capable of paying for herself. She didn't have an answer for that. Daniel tried to call me twice. I let both go to voicemail. The second one he asked, almost in passing, like it was an afterthought and not the most important sentence he could have said to me, whether I was okay, whether there was anything going on he should know about. I think some part of him suspected. I think some part of him had counted backward and done the math on the dates, and the doctor's appointments I'd mentioned in passing over the last 2 months, the ones he'd been too distracted to really hear. I didn't call him back. The annulment process turned into something messier and slower than either of us expected, partly because Daniel's lawyer, a man named Mr. Whitlock, kept presenting numbers in the financial disclosures that simply didn't add up. He claimed I'd contributed $40,000 in support to Daniel's family over the years, tuition, insurance, miscellaneous needs for Carolyn, but my own bank records, the ones I handed over without flinching because I'd kept meticulous track of every single transfer, showed the tuition payments alone totaled closer to $45,000 over 3 years, not counting the car insurance, the streaming bundle, or the $4,000 I'd quietly sent Carolyn the year her water heater broke. Mr. Whitlock's math was wrong in almost every direction, and my own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Calloway, took visible pleasure in correcting him line by line during the pre-trial mediation. What surprised me most wasn't the money. It was that Carolyn and Renata were both sitting in that mediation room at all, uninvited, technically not allowed, until Daniel's attorney quietly explained that they were there as character witnesses regarding the household dynamic. Ms. Calloway objected. The mediator allowed it anyway, with a warning that their presence wasn't to influence the financial terms. I sat there and watched Renata fidget with her bracelet, while Carolyn dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue she didn't need. And I understood, maybe for the first time with total clarity, that I had spent 7 years performing for an audience that had never once been on my side. I was 4 months pregnant by the time the mediation concluded. I hadn't told Daniel. I'd told my parents instead. My mother cried for an entirely different reason than she had the first time. And my father, a quiet, steady man who fixed things with his hands instead of his words, drove 3 hours that same weekend just to sit with me on the porch and not say much of anything, which was exactly what I needed. It was my father who eventually told Daniel, not out of spite. Out of fairness, he said, because a man should know he has a child on the way, whatever else has gone wrong between two adults. Daniel showed up at my parents' house unannounced on a Sunday, stood on the porch with his hands shoved in his pockets like a teenager, and asked if it was true. Yes, I said. He sat down on the porch step, put his head in his hands, and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I would have never asked for the annulment if I'd known. I know, I said. That's exactly the problem. He didn't understand at first. I had to explain it to him slowly, the way you explain something to someone who genuinely doesn't see what's wrong with the picture they've been living inside. The problem was never whether he would have left a pregnant wife. The problem was that he was willing to let his sister convince him I was cold and distant and not worth keeping, without ever once asking me what was actually going on in my own head, in my own body, in my own heart. The problem was that it took a pregnancy to make him reconsider a decision he should never have made in the first place. He asked if there was any chance for us. I told him I didn't know yet. I told him the annulment would still go through, because some things, once said out loud, can't be unsaid, but that I wasn't interested in shutting him out of his child's life, whatever happened between the two of us. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I moved back into my childhood bedroom for a while, painted the walls a pale yellow, set up a crib my father built from a kit he'd ordered without telling me, just left it assembled in the corner one afternoon like it had always been there. Daniel visited, awkwardly at first, then less so. He came to 2 of my appointments, sat in the waiting room because I wasn't ready to let him in the exam room yet, and the 3rd time, I let him come in. He cried when he heard the heartbeat. I didn't expect that to move me, but it did, a little. He cut his mother and sister off financially that spring. Quietly, without announcement, the way I should have noticed he was capable of doing all along, if anyone had ever asked him to. Carolyn called me twice more after that, her voice tight with something between anger and panic, asking whether I'd turned my husband against his own family. I told her I hadn't turned him against anyone. I'd simply stopped paying for the privilege of being treated like staff. I went into labor on a humid morning in early June, 4 days before my due date. My mother drove me to the hospital while my father called Daniel, who met us there, pacing the hallway in scrubs he hadn't bothered to change out of, because he'd left work the second he got the call. I labored for 14 hours. At one point, gripping my mother's hand so hard I left marks. I told myself this pain was the last thing his family would ever take from me without my permission, because everything after this moment was going to be entirely mine to decide. My daughter was born at 6:52 in the evening, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the entire room. The doctor placed her on my chest, and I looked down at her small, furious, perfect face and felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for the better part of a decade. I named her Eleanor. The annulment was finalized 6 weeks after she was born. Daniel and I never got back together, not in the way either set of grandparents probably hoped. But he showed up. Every week, sometimes twice, with diapers or formula, or just himself, sitting on my parents' porch holding his daughter while I finally, for the first time in years, slept through an entire afternoon without listening for footsteps in the hallway. Renata reached out once, almost a year later. She asked to meet for coffee. I almost said no. I said yes instead, mostly out of curiosity. She looked different, thinner, tired around the eyes in a way makeup couldn't quite cover. I was wrong, she said, turning her cup in small circles on the table without drinking from it. About a lot of things. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I might. I just felt tired the way you feel after putting down something heavy you've been carrying for far too long. I know, I said. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she added quickly. I just needed to say it. Okay, I said. And I meant it. Not okay as in forgiven. Okay as in heard, as in finished, as in I no longer needed anything from her, not even her apology. She asked, almost shyly, if she could see Eleanor sometime. I told her that was between her and Daniel now. That I wasn't going to be the gatekeeper of other people's relationships with my daughter. But I also wasn't going to pretend the last 7 years hadn't happened just because she'd finally noticed them. I left that coffee shop and drove straight to my parents' house, where my father was sitting on the living room floor, stacking blocks with Eleanor, while she shrieked with laughter every time the tower fell. I scooped her up and held her against my chest, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, and thought about how strange it was that the worst year of my life had handed me the one thing I'd wanted more than anything else. That night, after Eleanor was asleep, I sat by the window of the apartment I'd finally rented for the two of us. Small but mine, every wall and every dollar of rent accounted for by no one but me. And I thought about the woman I used to be. The one who scrubbed corners that didn't need scrubbing, who cooked dinners no one thanked her for, who paid for tuition and insurance and water heaters for people who would have let her disappear without a second thought. I am not that woman anymore. I learned the hard way that patience given to people who don't deserve it isn't a virtue. It's just permission for them to keep taking. I didn't lose my marriage because I was cold or distant the way Renata claimed. I lost it because I spent 7 years proving my worth to people who had already decided, long before I ever met them, that I would never be enough. What I gained instead was harder to explain and far more valuable. A daughter who looks at me like I hung the moon. A life that belongs entirely to me. And the quiet, steady knowledge, finally earned instead of hoped for, of exactly what I deserve. And exactly what I will never again settle for less than.